Charles Manson, the cult leader behind bars, a man whose twisted mind created one of the most notorious cults in history, and whose influence of fear, control, and manipulation still echoes long after his imprisonment. Charles Manson's story begins in the shadows of abandonment and neglect, long before the world ever knew his name. Born in 1934 to a teenage mother who was barely prepared for the burden of raising a child, Manson's earliest memories were stained with instability. His father vanished before he could even form an image of him, leaving behind only a name and emptiness. His mother, often lost in her own world of alcohol and reckless decisions, drifted in and out of his life, leaving young Charles to fend for himself in an environment that offered no security, no structure, and no sense of belonging. From the very start, the system became his caretaker. Reform schools and juvenile detention centers became the places he called home, though they were nothing more than cold walls and stricter punishments. In these institutions, Manson learned quickly that manipulation could be more powerful than brute force. He studied human behavior not out of curiosity, but out of survival. He figured out how to charm, deceive, and influence others to get what he wanted. Each rejection, each abandonment, carved into him a hunger for control. Control he had been denied as a child. By the time he was a teenager, crime was no longer an accident of desperation. It was his chosen path. Petty thefts, burglaries, and repeated arrests pulled him deeper into the correctional system, shaping him into someone who no longer believed in society's rules. Instead, he began to see the world as a place where the weak were used by the strong, and where he could only survive by bending others to his will. The broken child who had once cried for love and acceptance was being replaced by a manipulative young man who believed he could create his own reality, one in which he would never again be powerless. When Charles Manson was released from prison in the late 1960s, the world outside had changed, and he saw an opportunity to reshape himself into more than just an ex-convict. The counterculture movement was in full swing. Young people across America were rebelling against authority, seeking freedom, peace, and spiritual enlightenment. To most, this was a time of exploration and rebellion, but for Manson, it was the perfect breeding ground for control. He recognized the vulnerabilities of a generation searching for meaning, and he positioned himself as a man who could give it to them. Using a mix of charm, manipulation, and a distorted form of philosophy, Manson began gathering young followers, mostly women who felt lost, abandoned, or misunderstood by society. He offered them what they craved most: love, acceptance, and a sense of belonging. But this love came with conditions. Slowly, he stripped them of their individuality, encouraging them to abandon their families, their possessions, and even their sense of self. In exchange, he gave them the illusion of freedom. Freedom to live without rules, without judgment, and under his guidance alone. Music became his weapon of influence. Manson fancied himself a musician, often playing guitar and weaving his lyrics with ideas of universal love, spirituality, and cosmic destiny. To his followers, these weren't just songs. They were teachings, a scripture of sorts, convincing them that Manson was more than a man. He was a prophet. Drugs and communal living further broke down their resistance, creating a reality where his words carried absolute authority. Manson understood human weakness, and he exploited it without hesitation. He created an atmosphere where his followers believed they were part of something greater than themselves, a chosen family that stood apart from the corrupt outside world. In truth, they were surrendering their independence piece by piece, becoming the instruments of his growing vision. What began as a ragtag group of wanderers soon transformed into a loyal circle of disciples, ready to act, obey, and sacrifice in the name of their leader. Charles Manson's greatest weapon was not a gun or a knife. It was his ability to bend the human mind. He understood instinctively how to break down defenses, how to identify hidden fears, and how to twist desires into tools for his own power. Unlike other criminals who relied on violence alone, Manson mastered the art of psychological control, creating a world where his followers could no longer separate their own thoughts from his commands. He began with charm, presenting himself as a man who understood pain, rejection, and loneliness, emotions that so many of his followers already carried. By reflecting their struggles back to them, he made them believe he was the only person who truly saw them. Once trust was built, he chipped away at their sense of reality. He convinced them that society was corrupt, families were chains, and the only truth lay in his vision of freedom. But this freedom was an illusion. carefully designed to bind them closer to him. Music became a hypnotic tool. His songs, often sung around campfires or during drug-fueled nights, were laced with cryptic messages of destiny, love, and the coming chaos he claimed was inevitable. Every lyric, every chord, reinforced the idea that he was more than a man. He was a guide to something greater. Drugs, especially LSD, played a critical role in dissolving boundaries between fantasy and reality. Under the haze of altered states, his followers became more susceptible, more willing to believe whatever Manson whispered into their ears. Isolation further tightened his grip by separating his followers from the outside world and cutting off their ties to family and friends. He ensured there were no voices of reason to challenge his authority. On his remote ranch, Manson became the center of their universe. He used long, rambling monologues, part scripture, part madness, to condition them to obey without question. When doubts surfaced, he turned the group against the doubter, shaming them until they either submitted or were cast aside. Manson's manipulation was not just about control. It was about erasing individuality. His followers began to dress alike, speak alike, even think alike. They abandoned their own names, identities, and moral codes, replacing them with the reality he constructed for them. In his presence, resistance seemed impossible. They no longer saw him as a man, but as a prophet, a father, a godlike figure whose word was law. Through this psychological domination, Manson transformed ordinary young people into devoted instruments of his will. Among all of Charles Manson's twisted ideas, none was more dangerous or defining than his obsession with what he called Helter Skelter. Borrowing the name from a Beatles song, Manson twisted its innocent, chaotic imagery into a prophecy of apocalyptic destruction. To him, the song was not just music. It was a coded message from the universe, proof that the Beatles themselves were prophets speaking directly to him. He claimed it revealed the coming of a great race war, one that would tear America apart and reshape the world forever. In Manson's warped vision, society was on the brink of collapse. He preached to his followers that black Americans would rise against the white population, killing and destroying until civilization itself crumbled. But here lay the heart of his manipulation. He convinced his family that they were destined to survive this war and, after the chaos, emerge as leaders of a new world. He painted himself as a savior who had been chosen to guide them through the destruction into a paradise where they would reign supreme. This philosophy wasn't built on truth, but on fear and paranoia, carefully stoked by Manson's words. He convinced his followers that every news story, every cultural shift, was evidence of this looming war. He twisted civil rights struggles and social unrest into signs of his prophecy unfolding. Each headline was proof, and each event became a puzzle piece that only he could interpret. The more chaotic the outside world became, the more his prophecy seemed real to those who lived under his influence. Helter Skelter became more than an idea, it became a mission. Manson told his followers they had to play a role in igniting this race war, to push society toward the chaos he predicted. He made them believe that violence was not only justified, but necessary. He disguised murder as destiny, bloodshed as a higher calling, and crime as the will of the universe. To those under his control, this warped prophecy carried the weight of divine truth, and they were willing to act upon it without hesitation. What began as a Beatles song had become a blueprint for terror, one that Manson used to drive his followers deeper into madness. Through Helter Skelter, he gave them purpose, direction, and a cause to fight for, though in reality, it was nothing more than a reflection of his own delusions. By the summer of 1969, Charles Manson's twisted teachings had fully taken root within his followers, and the line between thought and action was erased. What had begun as philosophies and drug-fueled visions of a coming apocalypse now demanded proof, and Manson demanded loyalty in blood. His words became commands, and his family was ready to carry them out. On the night of August 8, 1969, Manson ordered a group of his closest followers to a house in Los Angeles, one he believed was connected to a man who had once rejected his music career ambitions. To Manson, this was not just revenge, but the spark to ignite Helter Skelter. That night, the quiet hills of Cielo Drive turned into a nightmare. Inside the house, actress Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, and several of her friends were brutally murdered. The killers, acting under Manson's orders, showed no mercy. Walls were smeared with blood, messages of terror left behind as symbols of their loyalty to him. The violence was shocking not only for its cruelty, but for its senselessness. Sharon Tate begged for the life of her unborn child, but her pleas were ignored. Each victim was slaughtered with a level of brutality that seemed ritualistic, as though the killers believed they were carrying out something larger than themselves. In truth, they were puppets acting out the delusions of their leader. But the bloodshed didn't end there. The very next night, Manson sent his followers to strike again, this time targeting the wealthy LaBianca family in their Los Angeles home. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were tied up, tortured, and stabbed dozens of times. Again, blood was used to scrawl messages on the walls, linking the killings to Manson's apocalyptic vision. These murders, random and horrifying, spread fear across the city. No one felt safe, and no motive seemed clear, except to those who understood Manson's obsession with chaos. The crime shocked the world. They weren't just murders. They were acts designed to terrify, confuse, and destabilize. Ordinary people, celebrities, and the wealthy elite all realized they could be targets. Manson's followers had proven that they were willing to kill without hesitation, guided not by their own hatred, but by the commands of the man they saw as a prophet. These nights of terror transformed Charles Manson from an obscure cult leader into one of the most feared names in America. The murders carried his twisted philosophy into reality, leaving behind scenes of unimaginable horror that would forever mark the dark legacy of his family. In the months following the brutal Tate, LaBianca murders, Los Angeles was paralyzed by fear. The crimes had no clear motive, no logical pattern, and the brutality was beyond comprehension. Police scrambled for leads, chasing false trails and misdirected theories, while Manson and his family continued to live on the Spawn Ranch, seemingly untouchable. But arrogance and chaos eventually unraveled the control Manson believed he had. The initial break came not directly from the murders, but from unrelated crimes committed by Manson's followers. Auto thefts, assaults, and constant clashes with law enforcement. A raid on the ranch finally brought police face to face with the group, though at first, they didn't realize they were dealing with the masterminds behind the infamous killings. It was only through piecing together testimony, confessions, and the strange, fanatical behavior of the followers that the puzzle began to form. Slowly, all trails pointed back to Manson. When the truth emerged, it shocked even seasoned investigators. Manson had never personally wielded the knife in the murders. Instead, he orchestrated them, commanding his followers to carry out the violence in his name. His ability to control others to kill for him made the case unlike anything the justice system had ever seen. The trial itself became one of the most notorious spectacles in American history. Manson, far from broken or repentant, turned the courtroom into his stage. With a carved swastika on his forehead and his wild, piercing stare, he played the role of prophet, leader, and manipulator all at once. His followers echoed his madness, sometimes chanting in unison, sometimes disrupting proceedings with eerie devotion. The prosecution's challenge was clear: to prove that a man who never struck a blow was still guilty of orchestrating murder. Through testimony, especially from former family member Linda Kasabian, the court heard chilling accounts of how Manson ordered the killings, how his words held more weight than law, morality, or conscience. The picture that emerged was of a man who didn't need to wield weapons. His influence was deadly enough. The media swarmed, turning the trial into a circus. Headlines screamed Manson's name. His face became a symbol of evil, and the public watched in morbid fascination as America confronted the reality of how far blind devotion could go. For many, the trial was not just about Manson. It was about the fragility of society itself, about how easily people could be manipulated into surrendering their morality and committing acts of pure horror. When the trial ended and Charles Manson was sentenced to death, later reduced to life imprisonment after California abolished the death penalty, many believed the world had finally been freed from his influence. But prison did not silence Manson. It gave him a different kind of stage. Behind the bars of maximum security facilities, he became an enduring symbol of darkness, a man who thrived on attention and notoriety even while locked away. Inside prison walls, Manson was treated like both an outcast and a celebrity. To the guards and officials, he was a dangerous manipulator who needed constant monitoring. To fellow inmates, he was unpredictable, sometimes charismatic, sometimes violent, often bizarre. He carved symbols into his forehead, spoke in riddles, and made wild claims about being both Christ and the devil. Yet, despite his confinement, Manson never stopped attracting fascination from the outside world. Letters poured in from admirers, and shockingly, some even sought to join his family long after the murders. Television interviews became another weapon in his arsenal of influence. When cameras pointed at him, Manson unleashed rambling monologues filled with half-truths, riddles, and philosophical twists. He mocked society, shifted blame, and painted himself as a victim of a corrupt system. His strange expressions, piercing eyes, and sudden outbursts made every appearance unforgettable. The media couldn't resist broadcasting his madness, and in doing so, they amplified his legend. Even decades after the murders, Manson maintained a cult-like aura. Young people who had never lived through the 1960s wrote to him, idolized him, and even visited him, seduced by the mystery of his name. Prison officials constantly worried about his ability to inspire from behind bars. He was denied parole multiple times, but each hearing turned into a spectacle, with Manson spouting cryptic statements and refusing to show remorse. Life in prison became an extension of his manipulation. He played mind games with guards, sought dominance over fellow inmates, and thrived on any opportunity to prove that confinement could not strip him of influence. The bars kept his body locked away, but his presence seeped through interviews, writings, and the myth that had grown around him. Charles Manson, the cult leader behind bars, continued to command attention long after his physical freedom was taken. Charles Manson's death in 2017 closed a chapter on his physical existence, but it did not erase the shadow he cast over history. His name had already become synonymous with evil, a symbol of how far manipulation, blind obedience, and fanaticism could go when placed in the hands of a disturbed mind. Decades after the murders, the story of Manson and his family still sends chills through society, not because of the crimes alone, but because of the unsettling truth they revealed about human vulnerability. The legacy Manson left behind was not one of ideology or revolution. It was a warning. His life became a study in how ordinary people, many of them young and searching for meaning, could be molded into instruments of violence under the influence of a charismatic leader. Universities, criminologists, and psychologists dissected his methods of control, using his story as a case study in cult psychology and mass manipulation. He became less a man and more a cautionary tale, a reminder of how dangerous unchecked influence can become. Yet, even in death, fascination with him persisted. Books, documentaries, films, and songs continued to explore his life, often blurring the line between exposing his crimes and sensationalizing his myth. This ongoing attention kept his name alive, ensuring that Manson remained an icon of darkness in popular culture. For some, he was a monster to fear. For others, disturbingly, he was a figure to admire, a testament to how warped legacies can take on a life of their own. The fear he generated never fully disappeared. Parents told their children his story as a warning. Survivors of the era recalled the dread of living to the murders, and society at large held on to the scars left by his actions. Charles Manson's family might have dissolved, but the lessons of their destruction lived on, embedded in America's collective memory as one of the darkest examples of human corruption and blind devotion. Charles Manson never held political power, never commanded an army, and never created anything of value. Yet his name endures, etched into history as a symbol of manipulation, cruelty, and the dangers of blind devotion. His story is not one of greatness, but a warning of how charisma without conscience, influence without morality, and leadership without compassion can destroy lives and corrupt souls. Behind bars, Manson may have been caged, but the lessons of his reign of fear remain free, echoing as a reminder that darkness often hides behind a mask of charm. His legacy is not power. It is the eternal caution of what happens when humanity surrenders its will to a man unworthy of trust.